One of the speakers at the summit this morning was Senator Rand Paul. Here are his remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Jim. I think you're doing a great job, and Heritage continues to grow. I think they say online we've got maybe 25,000 people watching online. And I asked Jim laughingly if this was off the record and I could say anything I want. Could I just be frank? And he said, yeah, go ahead. Nobody's going to be in there from the media. So here goes. I thought you hear a lot of speeches and everybody's going to give you lots of speeches and you may have already heard a lot. I'd like to make it a little more interactive, so we're going to poll the crowd to begin with. Media and cameramen, you may participate also. I'd like to know who in the crowd thinks that judicial restraint is a great philosophy versus judicial activism. We'll start with judicial restraint. Who in the crowd thinks that your legal philosophy would be judicial restraint? This is going to be a tough sell. How many people think judicial activism is the way to go, and that's really what we should have as an activist court? Nobody. This is really going to be a tough sell. All right, does anybody know why Justice Roberts did not strike down Obamacare? Judicial restraint. So I guess everybody here is for Obamacare, right? And thinks that the court should stay the heck out of Obamacare, and Obamacare, was just fine because the majority wanted it. In fact, that's what Justice Roberts said. He said that we should not get in the way of the majority. Do you know where that comes from? That comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great progressive. Back in the Lochner case, when he dissents in the Lochner case, what does Oliver Wendell Holmes says? He says that the court has no business getting in a way to what the majority will is. We should leave it up to the majority. So if you're for judicial restraint, I guess, then what happens when a legislature does bad things? What happens when legislature says, well, we're going to pass Jim Crow laws throughout most of the 19th century, most of the 20th century? Should we have an activist court that comes in and overturns that? So it goes back. Can we have the first slide? The only slide. I won't bore you with a lot of slides, but we have one slide. Where's it going to be? Oh, it's going to be I can't see it, so that's not going to help me any. So we have a timeline, basically. We go back and we start in 1905 with Lochner, and we go all the way through Obamacare. And the question is, in each of these cases, what should conservatives be for, restraint or activism? So we go back to Lochner, and in the Lochner case, state legislatures were becoming more progressive, and they were restricting the right or the liberty of contract. And so what happened is you had an activist court in the Lochner case that rules 5-4 and says states can't interfere with the right to contract. So the question is, are you for activism or restraint when it comes or when it is with regard to state governments interfering with the liberty to contract? We move on a little bit later and we get into the New Deal. And here it's not state governments, it's the federal government. The federal government's passing all kinds of laws, assuming new powers that weren't essentially in the Constitution. So you once again have an activist court in the beginning, until FDR got his way. You have an activist conservative court who overturns federal laws, one after another, until finally you get a majority of FDR appointees who say, oh no, judicial restraint is the way to go. But then you move on a little bit longer. And as you come out of the Depression, you go into the time where we're looking at Brown versus the board, and we're looking at institutionalized either racism or separation or segregation. What's the position of judicial restraint? Position of judicial restraint is let the states do whatever they want. Is that the conservative position? I frankly think it's not my position. I think if the states do wrong, that we should overturn them. That there is a role for the Supreme Court to mete out justice. The 14th Amendment gives the Supreme Court, it gives the federal government a role in saying the states can't do certain things. There's a book called The Conscience of the Constitution by Timothy Sandefur, which I think is a great book because he talks about it in that if we were to say, well, gosh, we believe in just states' rights, the federal government has no role in the states, well, could you be basically in favor of what John Calhoun said? Not only John Calhoun supported slavery, but John Calhoun supported sort of a tyranny of state government. He thought state government could do anything it wants. Is that sort of the liberty position? Is that the conservative limited government position that we believe so much in a small federal government that there is no role nationally to say to a state government they can't do certain things? So it comes to Brown. I'm not a judicial restraint guy either. I'm a judicial activist when it comes to Lochner. I'm a judicial activist when it comes to the New Deal. But I'm also a judicial activist when it comes to Brown. I think the federal government was right to overturn state governments that were saying that separate but equal is fine. Plessy versus Ferguson's a mistake, all right? Plessy versus Ferguson is judicial restraint. So we get to Brown, I'm an activist. All right, then we go to the next one. What's the big bugaboo? What's the next one we talk about when we want to know about activism versus restraint? It's Griswold. And you say, why are we even having this discussion? Does any of this have anything to do with politics or current events? Does anybody remember George Stephanopoulos' question in the presidential debates last time? They asked them all, what do you think about Griswold? Well, a lot of people didn't know what Griswold was probably. But Griswold had to do with birth control. The state government said you can't sell birth control to women. And so if you're a states' rights kind of person, you say, I guess, hands off. If you believe in judicial restraint, you're like, let the states do what they want. That's a state right. Or you might say, well, individuals have rights also, and states can't tread upon individual rights. And then you might say, well, maybe I am for Griswold. Maybe I am for overturning the state law that says you can't have birth control. And so there's a question again. Are you an activist or restraint? Some say, well, Griswold led to Roe. I guess you're for Roe also. Well, in Roe, you actually have a competition of rights, I think. You have a competition of rights between a mother and a child. So it's a little bit different than just whether or not you're restricting someone's liberty, because I think there are two individuals involved. Well, the other side would say there's not, but I don't think Roe is as clear-cut as far as restraint or activism. Why is this pertinent? Because we move all the way up to Obamacare. When we get to Obamacare, whether he believes it or not, I don't know, but Justice Roberts laid down the gauntlet and said judicial restraint is why the majority can do whatever they want, basically. Not only did he say that, he basically said that if there are two arguments, two equal arguments for whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional, whether it's a tax or a penalty, we just have to accept that basically the presumption is of constitutionality. This kind of gets back to this idea of restraint. If we believe in judicial restraint, we presume the majority is correct. We presume that laws are constitutional until we can prove otherwise. Now, there is a school of thought that thinks differently. Randy Barnett writes about something of this. He talks about the presumption of liberty, that maybe we should start out with a presumption of liberty. I liken it to sort of saying, well, maybe we should be presumed innocent until found guilty. Maybe we should presume to be free until we are restricted. Yes, I've got one convert. Yes. My point is really not to try to convert you from judicial restraint to judicial activism, but to think about it. Because I think it's not as simple as we make it sound. We say we don't want judges writing laws. Well, I don't want judges writing laws either, but do I want judges to protect my freedom? Do I want judges to take an activist role in defense of liberty? Do I want them to presume liberty and put the burden on the government to prove constitutionality? I think this is important, and it became very important in the case with regard to Obamacare. In that, basically, Justice Roberts says that it's not his role to replace the majority will. Now, some of you might say, well, I'm still for judicial restraint. I don't care about any of those cases. We just need a better majority. That is an argument. But the question has to come also if you don't have a better majority. If you have a Jim Crow majority in the South, does the court have a role in overturning something where a person's individual rights are at stake? I think they do. I think it's an important debate because ultimately ideas are important. I think it was Victor Hugo that said that ideas are sometimes really more important than strong armies. That basically ideas are the presupposition behind all of this, that precede all of this and really empower all of us. I think as we look forward to what kind of government we want or what kind of role we think government has, what kind of role the judiciary has, it's important to decide and to examine ourselves whether for restraint or activism with regard to the court. Another constitutional question we have is on the separation of powers. And I think this is an equally important question. It's a legislative question and possibly a judicial question as well. There's a professor from Tufts who wrote recently, and he said that basically the separation, there's an equilibrium that's supposed to be there between the different powers, between the different branches, but we're having a collapse of the separation of powers. We're having a collapse of this equilibrium. Our founding fathers talked about there being sort of an ambition, that we would pit one ambition against another. An ambition for the legislature should be an ambition that is pitted against the ambition of the presidency. The hope was, and many times in our history this ambition was, I think, beyond party label. Unfortunately, I think now things are so partisan that if it's a Democrat president usurping authority, all Democrats will support them. But if it's a Republican president usurping and taking on too much executive power, all Republicans will support him, instead of what our founding fathers intended was that Congress would object to having its power taken by the executive branch. And these ambitions would be pitted back and forth, and those ambitions would push us forward towards more of an equilibrium. It isn't just on immigration that the president has usurped and created and brought upon the executive branch power that's not there. It is also in Obamacare amending the rules. We're going to have another ruling in the Supreme Court on that coming up. But it's also on the power of war. The power to declare war was absolutely and without question given to the legislature. We've been at war now for 5 months and no vote in Congress. So before Christmas, I decided I would declare war. And I decided I would declare war on a water bill. And people were like, why is he trying to declare war on a water bill? And I said, well, it's my only avenue for having any power around here. I'm not chairman of the committee. I don't get to decide the agenda. Well, they've been working on this water bill for 6 years. And as Jim will attest to, sometimes they get pretty annoyed if you try to amend something they're trying to do. So I amended it with the declaration of war for ISIS, because I said I think they are a threat. I think, frankly, they're a threat to our embassy in Baghdad. They're a threat to our consulate in Erbil. And, frankly, it's been pretty apparent that they're a threat to Americans by killing Americans. And there should be a debate. This shouldn't happen with the president. The president shouldn't do this alone. And so these debates have to go on. And to me, I think what's more important than belonging to one political party or another is the ideas of the Constitution and how the whole goal of the Constitution was in limiting power and trying to not let too much power gravitate to one body or to one person. While I'm here in Washington, in the future, as long as I'm here, that will be my overriding goal, is to try to limit power and to try to keep too much power from gravitating to one person or body. And I think this is above and beyond all partisan politics, and I will continue as long as I'm given that privilege. Thank you very much. And I would ask people to raise hand if I converted you from restraint to activism, but I'm afraid to.
Ray, why don't
So,
we sit
all
down
right.
so we both have microphones here? Are they both on? All right. We'll take some questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. My question is very simple. Why does
Jennifer Rubin of Washington Post, why is she obsessed with you? Okay, my question is about ISIS. I asked this question to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. I guess that which president is smarter, the one who blew up $1 trillion in Iraq, gave a couple of thousand of American lives, or the president who is saying, okay, these people are crazy, let them fight with each other, we don't have to get involved in that. He didn't answer in public, but if you want to ask, if you want to know what was his answer, I can tell you privately. So I'm a Sunni Muslim, so my question is very simple. If I want to die, how smart it is for you to pick a fight for nothing will do. It's absolute. See, Muslims, they are sadists, they are crazy, they are irrational, they live in the past, they don't live in the present or future. What do Americans have to gain by picking up a fight for nothing?
Good question.
I guess the way I would look at it is, and I say this often because I think it bears repeating, I think there's a long war going on. The long war, in some ways, is Sunni versus Shia, but it's also within the Islamic faith. There's a war going on between what I call civilized Islam and barbaric Islam. And some conservatives like to criticize the president and say, oh, why is he being so nice to Islam? I think sometimes what he's trying to do is point out that there are differences, because if you want to paint with a broad brush that everybody in Islam is an enemy of the United States, you're talking about a horrific, terrible kind of war with, 1 billion people hating America. I don't think that's true. I think that the vast majority of Islam is peace-loving and civilized. But if it's 5 or 10% of Islam, that's a lot of people, and that's a big problem. The long war is not only Sunni versus Shia, but there's also a long war between a barbaric form of Islam against mainstream Islam and against the West. I think no matter what we do, we have to defend ourselves. So, printing cartoons shouldn't engender people murdering you. And so we do have to defend ourselves. France has to defend themselves. We have to defend ourselves. We also have to defend our diplomatic missions around the world. I put a lot of blame at the feet of Hillary Clinton for not defending the embassy or the consulate in Benghazi. I think she did a terrible job. And I think that it's inexcusable, basically, when you're asked for security that you not provide it. That is the job of the commander-in-chief, and that's the job of the executive branch. The same goes, though, for Erbil or for Baghdad. While I don't want to be in the middle of the long war, because I don't think there really is an answer in this long war, and that much of this war should be left to be fought by the Middle East, at the same time, we can't leave our embassies unprotected. So we have a couple choices. We either come home completely and bring everything home, or we defend our embassies and our interest. I think at this point, what I would say is we defend our interests. But that doesn't mean that we have to be involved in every war and skirmish. And I just end by saying one thing. If there's any one true thing that I think is irrefutable and that the facts really support, is that every time we've gotten involved to topple a secular dictator, it's been replaced with chaos and the rise of radical Islam. And that would be in Hillary's war in Libya. This would also be, though, in the Republican war in Iraq. I think what's over there now is less stable than before. And so I think there are more problems with the rise of Iran as a problem because there is no counterbalance in Iraq anymore. And so some of these problems are insolvable. The only thing that I think we have to know from our perspective is we should defend our country and our people.
Senator Paul makes an important distinction, and it's something we've looked at a lot at Heritage. I mean, there is political Islam, welding itself with the powers of government, perverting the basic religion itself, and there is a civilized, more, I guess, religious Islam. And making that distinction is very important, I think, in solving the problem itself. Some other questions for Senator Paul. Yes, sir.
While I agree with your definition of an activist judge, that might not have been the definition I had in my mind when you asked the question. But to your point about separation of powers and the intention of the Founding Fathers, how do we get that into a pop culture or a everyman definition that we can understand? Because it does transcend partisan. When you bring those topics up and get out of the labels of really what that means, I think would easily transcend partisan politics. But some people don't understand that, and we fall into the Democrats are nice, Republicans are mean, 2 seconds, and we end up in this mess. How do we get more grassroots?
I think one simple sentence I would say is that unelected bureaucrats shouldn't write laws. But who are the unelected bureaucrats working for? That's a separation of powers issue. All of the bureaucracy of government works for the president. And so we have abdicated our role as Congress. People say, well, Obamacare was 2,000 pages. That's so long. Well, yeah, that's pretty long, but the regulations are already 20,000 pages. So much of it's being done without our knowledge, but without us doing what we need to do. So there's this debate right now over defunding the immigration, the executive order. I'm all for that. However, I'm for that and about 1,000 other things on every bill. I want 1,000 instructions or thousands of instructions on every appropriation bill. And people say, oh, you're just trying to tie the hands of the president. That's our job. I don't care if it's a Republican president. The power of the purse, when people talk about the power of the purse, those are instructions. We've been writing sort of outlines of bills, sending them to the president, and no matter which party they are, they do whatever they want. But as a consequence, they do many things that we didn't intend. I also think that regulations that are written that are very expensive, like over $100 million, ought to come back. Jim was the lead sponsor of something called the REINS Act when he was in the Senate. I have it now. It says that any regulation written by a bureaucrat, written by another branch of government that is very, very expensive, has to come back and be voted on to become law by the Congress. That would go a long way towards reasserting our authority and reasserting the balance of powers.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Senator Paul, I thought that you're your father, is one of the big founders of the Libertarian Party, and that one of the main thrusts was you were against regulations and bureaucracy. I'm glad you're slowing down this president by the regulations, but are you for regulations in a constitutional way rather than just more red tape? I thought that was what most Libertarians were against.
I'll give you an example of that. We passed a law that, the Clean Water Act, that says that no one can discharge pollutants into a navigable stream. I'd vote for that. I think that if you've got a company and you have benzene and you're dumping it in the Ohio River, not only should you be punished, if you are doing it purposely, you probably should be in prison for doing that. So I am for that regulation. That's a federal government regulation. However, that was passed in the 1970s. And it says discharging pollutant into a navigable stream. Over time now they've defined dirt as a pollutant and your backyard as a stream. And we now spend $100 million policing private property, and I think we do so much to harass private property owners that we've forgotten about the stuff we're supposed to be doing, which is the Ohio River and the Great Lakes and the oceans. So there is a role for government in communal property, but we've gone way too far in what we've done to individuals. One quick example, Ken Lucas put clean dirt on his own land to raise the elevation to sell lots in southern Mississippi. He's been in prison for 10 years. He was 70 when he went to jail. He's now 79 and still in prison for putting clean dirt on his own land. That is a crime, and whoever put him in jail is the one who really ought to be in jail.
Okay, one more question, then we better call it.
Senator, I was just at an event with Americans for Limited Government, and they were making a libertarian case against TPA, that it was ceding too much power to the president. Do you agree with that? What's your view of this?
I have mixed feelings some on, you're talking about the authority that's given for the trade agreements. And what's the TPA, what's the actual acronym stand for again?
Trade Promotion Authority.
Trade Promotion Authority. There is an argument to be made by some on the separation of powers that by giving this authority to the president, that you've taken power that should be the Congress's. There's also, I guess, another argument that these are really treaties and they ought to be actually done as treaties, and they're not. They're done by simple majority. But I'm also a big believer in free trade, that I think free trade is a good thing. So there have been libertarians or libertarian conservatives, my father included, who voted against some of the trade deals because they felt like they gave up sovereignty to international bodies. I think that's a valid point. I have voted for the trade deals, though, because like a lot of things in Washington, I've weighed the good and the bad, and I think the good of trade has caused me to vote for things that I think aren't perfect, basically. I think the perfect way is that we would lessen our trade barriers and do that through the sovereignty of the Congress. But unfortunately, I think that what we've been offered to vote on has not exactly been that. But trade has helped people, and trade helps even the poorest among us more than anybody else. I think the average person who shops in a Walmart-type store, or Walmart, they're everywhere, saves about $800 or $900 a year because of free trade.
Good. Let's thank Senator Rand Paul.